This is Dateline News and Conversation. For the past month or so, I haven't been very active in producing these shows, Dateline News and Conversation. But in this past month, Israel and the war on Gaza has consumed the world's attention. Our good friend Dimitri Lascaris is back tonight. You know him. He's a lawyer, a journalist, and an activist. He's written a two-part article that, in my opinion, is a blockbuster. Dimitri, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Regis. Always a pleasure talking to you, my friend.
Well, the title of the article, Israel, America's Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier is Sinking. Let's start out with this. One of the first things you said in the article was, I'm quoting, from its founding in 1948, Israel has gotten away with murder. Would you be able to give me some concrete examples of that?
That opening statement you read is both literal and metaphorical. It has actually gotten away with murder, mass murder, but also other crimes that aren't murder, but nonetheless amount to severe violations of international law and human rights principles. So from 1948 to the current time, for example, Israel has repeatedly violated the sovereignty of neighboring states in the region throughout really the Middle East, including most importantly Syria and Lebanon. It's also violated the sovereignty of Iran, of Iraq, of Egypt, of Tunisia, amongst other states, by launching attacks, military attacks, or other quasi-military operations on their soil or in their airspace without lawful justification in international law. And in the process has killed many of their civilians and military personnel. Israel has occupied the West Bank illegally since 1967 and has effectively annexed the West Bank. This is territory that was set aside by the United Nations for a future Palestinian state. I believe there's some now 800,000 Israeli citizens living illegally as settlers on this land, practically, constituting a practical impediment to any Palestinian state. Israel has purported to annex territory in violation of international law. The Golan Heights is one example. It claims the Golan is now its territory. It does not belong to Israel, as the international community has said repeatedly. It belongs to Syria. The same is also true of Jerusalem. It has annexed Jerusalem. Jerusalem was set aside by the international community to be the capital of both Israel and the new Palestinian state on terms to be approved by the United Nations. On top of all of that, Israel has committed all manner of human rights abuses of, the population, the Palestinian population living under its control. It has engaged in torture, including the torture of children. And here I'm relying upon Israeli human rights organizations, not just testimonials of Palestinians, but investigations done by B'Tselem and Yesh Din, amongst others, into their abuses of Palestinian children. They've engaged in ethnic cleansing. They've demolished the homes, collective punishment, demolished the homes of families, one of whose members was accused, whether rightly or wrongly, of having committed a terrorist act. The blockade on Gaza, 2.3 million people, one half of whom are children, which has caused immense suffering since its inception over 15 years ago, is an act of collective punishment. Every single day, the people of Gaza have been subjected to collective punishment for the crimes, the actual or alleged crimes of Hamas. It has, killed journalists. Dozens and dozens of journalists have been massacred by Israel just in the course of this current attack on Gaza. It has attacked hospitals, United Nations schools whose coordinates were provided to its military. It has attacked ambulances. It has killed medical workers. I personally know a Canadian-Palestinian doctor who was working in Gaza and was wearing garb in which he was identified as a doctor, clearly identified as a doctor, who was shot in both legs by an Israeli sniper in 2018. By the way, the Canadian government did nothing about that. I know a Palestinian Canadian artist. I just interviewed her yesterday, who's living under occupation in Bethlehem, who was shot by an Israeli sniper. Why? Because she was taking photographs of an Israeli skunk truck spreading noxious fluids on the homes of Palestinians living in Bethlehem. I could go on and on and on, Regis. Okay, that I hope will give people a sense of the utter criminality of this state. And let's be clear, it doesn't matter who's been in power, whether it was somebody from the Labour Party or somebody from the Likud or some coalition government, including far-right parties like you have today. These crimes have been committed throughout the history of Israel with total impunity. No one at the highest levels of the Israeli government has ever been held accountable for any of these crimes.
I want to go back to a couple of things. You mentioned the words occupied and colonized. One of the crimes that I will never forget was the bulldozing of Rachel Corrie, who stood up in front of a bulldozer to try to prevent them from razing to the ground another Palestinian village. That woke up some people in the United States and the West, but it's an example of these flagrant violations of international law and law, period. You mentioned collective punishment. People are beginning to talk about that, and especially people who have not taken sides with Israel. I'd like your opinion on a couple of things. As soon as the October 7th Hamas raid, and it was a military raid, in my opinion, Israel and the West started saying this is Israel's 9/11. This was a terrorist attack. I happen to be one of the people that believe this was not a terrorist attack. This was a justified military attack by a military arm, call them what you want, that finally, after all these years, not only had the ability and the intelligence, but they had the guts, the desire to strike back, and strike back they did. The rest of the world painted it as a horrendous act, unjustifiable act. You're an attorney. I know how you feel about Palestine and everything else. What are your thoughts on, was that a terrorist attack, or was that actually a military confrontation attack, completely justified by any laws of war or international law? Your thoughts on that?
Well, to answer that question, we have to ask what is terrorism, and I think there's no definitive definition of terrorism, but one that I think is broadly employed by Western commentators is the targeting of civilian infrastructure or civilian persons with violence for political purposes. Well, according to that definition, the biggest terrorist in the Middle East is Israel, because Israel has targeted more civilians and more civilian infrastructure to achieve its political objective of securing complete control, not only of historic Palestine, but of greater Israel, which includes pieces of territory like the Golan Heights, which are not part of historic Palestine. It's done that more than any militant group, including Hamas, or any state in the entire Middle East, by a wide margin for decades. It's the number one terrorist in the Middle East, the state of Israel. The only bigger terrorist in the entire world is probably the United States government. By the classic definition of terrorism, the United States government, whose victims vastly outnumber those of Israel, is the arch terrorist of our time. So let's just be very clear about that. Now, going to Hamas, let's start with the basic proposition of international law. No competent international lawyer would deny this. Persons living under occupation have the right to employ armed resistance in order to defeat the occupier. Now, the right to armed resistance is not unlimited. So, for example, you cannot target innocent civilians, unarmed civilians, with violence. Now, and so the question here, for those of us who want to know, did Hamas commit acts of terrorism on October 7th? Is, did it target civilians, unarmed civilians? Certainly, it targeted military personnel. The Israelis themselves admitted that they lost hundreds of military and security personnel on that day. I think 3 to 4 Israeli military bases were overrun by Hamas. So part of the operation was clearly lawful and legitimate, the part that was targeting military personnel. The question then becomes, did they target innocent civilians, unarmed civilians? There is evidence that some of the militants, and I want to be very clear about this. Everybody says, when they talk about this in the Western mainstream discourse, they say Hamas did this or Hamas did that. There are hundreds of militants belonging to Hamas, and not just Hamas. I understand that there were 2 other militant groups, including Islamic Jihad, who participated in this operation, passed through the openings in the gates surrounding Gaza, the open-air concentration camp, on that day. And in addition, according to Hamas, and this is entirely believable if you ask me, other people who were not actually soldiers of the organization broke through that barrier, some of them having arms. So if we establish that people, Israeli civilians, innocent, unarmed Israeli civilians, were killed that day, and that does appear to be the case, that some were, in some numbering somewhere in the hundreds, it's not necessarily the case that they were killed by Hamas militants. And furthermore, even if they were killed by Hamas militants, it's not necessarily the case that that was authorized by the leadership of Hamas. They may have gone out and committed their own acts of retribution and terrorism without authority and contrary to instructions from the leadership of Hamas. We simply don't know. I've seen no evidence whatsoever that the leadership of Hamas directed its soldiers to attack innocent Israeli civilians. Now, evidence has also emerged, and I imagine that this is the basis, at least partly the basis of your skepticism, that a lot of those civilians, people who do appear to have been Israeli civilians unarmed, were mowed down by Israeli forces who were killing indiscriminately the militants, the Palestinian militants, and any hostages or other Israeli civilians who were in their vicinity. This appears to have been done with ferocious violence by Israeli Apache helicopters. There are attacks of ground troops, accounts from Israelis themselves who were held by Hamas temporarily on that day, that Israeli ground troops fired indiscriminately on Israeli civilians and Hamas militants. So I think it's quite clear from the evidence that we have that some of those civilians, those Israeli civilians who died on that day and who do not appear to have been armed to pose a threat to the Hamas militants, were killed by Israeli forces. But there also is evidence that some militants who may or may not have been Hamas, who may or may not have been acting on instructions from leadership, did kill unarmed civilians. So I'm prepared, for purposes of, based upon the evidence I've seen thus far, to accept that there were acts committed by Palestinian militants on that day that meet the classic definition of terrorism. But again, on whose instructions they were acting, whether they were acting on anybody's instructions, whether they were actually soldiers of Hamas, that remains unestablished. And it's also absolutely clear that a large part of the force employed on that day by Hamas was entirely legitimate because it was targeting the occupier, the army of the occupier. And I repeat what I said at the outset: whatever may have happened on that day, it pales in comparison to the acts of terrorism that Israel is engaged in both prior to October 7th and since October 7th.
Yeah. You're making some very good points, and some of these points are not being discussed enough, I think, with bloggers, with the alt media, and certainly not in the mainstream media. You also wrote that, and I quote, "Now the world gasps in horror as Israel inflicts upon Palestinians a textbook case of genocide, with Israeli leaders openly declaring their genocidal intent." Explain a little bit more about that.
the definition of genocide is, you can easily find it. It's in the Genocide Convention, to which I believe all Western nations are party. And by the way, Article 1 of the Genocide Convention obliges all parties to take steps, active, positive steps to prevent genocide. They're not simply obliged to refrain from committing genocide. They have to, when a serious risk of that occurring, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, they have to take active steps to stop it. If not, they're violating the Genocide Convention. So the Genocide Convention's definition of genocide is not particularly complicated. And by the way, the question you're asking me is a legal question, Regis. I can't, I have to say this constantly because I find myself oftentimes being engaged on social media by people who aren't lawyers, don't have a clue about international law, appear to have never even read the Genocide Convention. And they're talking to me as though, as laypersons, they have the ability and the understanding to pass judgment on this question. Well, I would never say that it's not impossible for laypersons to form accurate legal opinions. They can, but they should at least show a degree of humility when they're talking to a lawyer who has taken a passionate interest in international law for 30 years and recognize that they themselves don't have that same level of expertise. This is a legal question. And under the Genocide Convention's definition of genocide, there are basically two elements of the definition. The first is there's a series of acts specified. It's not an exhaustive list of the acts that must be committed for genocide to be taking place, but I would say it's an illustrative list. And there are 5 or 6 acts, one of which is killing members of an ethnic group, another of which is depriving them of the conditions necessary for life. And let's recall here, not only has it killed, I believe now 16,000 Palestinians in the 48 days that this monstrosity has been going on. Over 6,000 of them are children. 70% of them are women or children. It has also left some 7,000 people missing, many of them under the rubble, either dead or dying. The rubble of civilian infrastructure that Israel has intentionally destroyed. Not only has it killed members, not only has it imposed a blockade, a total blockade of food, fuel, water, medicines, which was clearly designed to inflict massive pain, suffering, and death upon the population of Gaza. It's in fact committed all of the acts that are identified. I've given you 2 in the list of material acts in the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention. So that's part 1 of the definition. The other one is intent. They have to have the intent, the leadership of the country or whoever it is that's committing genocide, to destroy all or part of a national group or an ethnic group. I stress the word part. There's a misconception that in order to commit genocide, you have to have the intention to eradicate each and every member of the targeted group. That's just not true. That's clear from the plain language of the definition of genocide. This is unquestionably a material part of the population in Gaza, which they're obviously trying to destroy. This is some 2.3 million people. This is a very large proportion of the Palestinian population living under occupation. So there's no question that that they satisfy that element of the definition, and their intention is manifested just by their statements. Statement after statement after statement confirms that they intend to wipe out the Palestinians living in Gaza. You had the Israeli prime minister. I'll just give you a few examples. The Israeli prime minister said, we are going to turn Gaza into an island of ruins. We had other Israeli officials saying that the objective was not to, it was not some discrete military objective, but to inflict maximum damage upon Gaza. We have the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, saying that nobody in Gaza is innocent because they could have, he apparently includes in this category children. And his reasoning is they could have risen up, according to him, and stopped Hamas from having power. But because they failed to stop Hamas from having power, they bear guilt, at least indirectly, for what Hamas has done, and therefore they're legitimate targets. You had the defense minister saying that the people of Gaza are human animals and that they would put no restraint whatsoever on the military, and nobody would be held accountable for violating the laws of war. And there was this absurd unbelievable. I mean, it was almost surreal video that was posted by Israel's national broadcaster of Israeli children singing that we will annihilate Gaza. Annihilate Gaza, not Hamas, Gaza. I mean, what more evidence do you need of their intent to destroy at least part of the Palestinian population? To me, it's not just, me who says it's a textbook case. Raz Siegel, a genocide scholar from the United States, said it. A senior human rights lawyer, Craig Moktaber, who resigned in protest over the failure of the United Nations to act, he said it's a textbook case of genocide. A couple of days ago, the UN Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women and Children said in a public statement that we are witnessing the unfolding of genocide. Just before that, the International Commission of Jurists, 60 of the most accomplished jurists, international jurists and lawyers in the world, came out with a statement saying that the risk of genocide being committed in Gaza was now so high that the Article 1 obligation to prevent genocide had been triggered, and that all states now have a duty to take positive, active measures to stop what is happening in Gaza. So the international human rights community, it's not just me, is coalescing around this notion that this is clearly a genocide. It's a slam dunk case of genocide, Regis. The fact that we are debating this rather than taking steps to stop it now is outrageous. It's just completely unconscionable.
Okay. I think in layman's terms, you've clarified Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. It's clearly, to a layman, that the act of genocide has been and is taking place. Clearly, there's been intent. It's been stated repeatedly. But now we come to the other part of that convention. The signatories are supposed to take immediate action. What the hell is going on with the international community? Are they so afraid of America and Israel that nobody, in my opinion, nobody has done anything to, as you said, positively, factually, existentially, do anything to stop this?
Well, some states have done some things. There have been a number of states, including South Africa, Belize, Colombia, Honduras, who have severed diplomatic relations with Israel, which is important. It's not sufficient, but it's important. There are states that have, for some time refused to enter into economic relations with Israel. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia just called for an international arms embargo on Israel. That would be a significant measure. But is it enough? No, clearly it's not enough. It's not remotely enough. And I would go so far as to say, with the possible exception of the countries that have severed their diplomatic relations with Israel, other than imposing an arms embargo, there's not much more they can do. They don't have the military capacity to intervene. So what that obligation entails depends, and this was recognized by the International Commission of Jurists, on the ability of a state to actually stop it. And the state that is the ICJ specifically identified the state that is most best positioned to stop it, and that's the United States. So the burden under the Genocide Convention, because of its relationship with Israel and Israel's reliance upon the United States for military, economic, and political support, is such that the United States is the state that has the highest obligation of intervention under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention. The United States is not only not doing, and I believe it could literally with the snap of its fingers put a stop to this. Because Israel is totally dependent upon the United States in every conceivable way. I mean, what happened when October 7th, when those attacks occurred? The United States sent really a massive, unprecedented armada to the Middle East to deter anybody from intervening militarily in the horrors that began to be inflicted upon the people of Gaza on that day. The United States has been shipping massive amounts of armaments. And it's unlike, in the case of Ukraine, where it was detailing to a reasonable degree what weapons it was sending. It won't do that with respect to Israel. It doesn't want us to know what they're giving to the Israelis because I'm sure the reason for that is because a lot of that weaponry is actually being used to kill Palestinian civilians en masse and destroy Palestinian infrastructure. The United States is not only not stopping it. Oh, and by the way, they opposed and killed a UN Security Council resolution which called for a ceasefire in Gaza. So they're at the political level, at the military level, they voted to give Israel some $14 billion in aid over and above the $3.8 billion annually in military aid. There's no real consideration by the Biden administration of putting a stop to that military aid. So what is the United States doing? It's doing the opposite of what it is obliged to do under the Genocide Convention. It is facilitating the genocide. It is enabling Israel to commit the genocide. It is stopping other states from intervening politically, economically, or militarily to put a stop to the genocide. And that's ultimately when people talk about the United States government's sort of status legally vis-a-vis what is happening in Gaza, I recoil at the word complicity because it's not really sufficient to explain from a legal and moral perspective what the United States is doing. The United States government, I believe, could arguably be characterized as a full-blown participant in this genocide. It is a co-party to the genocide. It's not simply complicit.
Well, and I believe that the United States is a co-party, is in a direct hot war with Russia at the very same time. We can mince words and parse words, and is it a proxy war, and what defines a proxy war? I think it's perfectly clear to any objective American, I'm talking about Americans now, to be able to deny what has not been hidden from them all these years. I mean, I go back to Rachel Corrie. Rachel Corrie's death caused a lot of people to rise up, caused a lot of people to take part in the Gaza freedom flotillas, caused a lot of people to get out into the streets with signs. And now we're seeing these massive protests around the world, including in Washington, D.C., and large and small cities around the United States. It's obvious that people have seen this and are saying we've had enough. And they're telling their government, and people around the world are telling their governments, you need to stop this. You mentioned Israel's impunity is coming to an end. Now we'll segue to this other part of the article, America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. You also wrote this: Israel's domination of the Middle East was not made possible, as Israel's propagandists would have us believe, by the moral and intellectual superiority of its ruling class. You went on to say, this diminutive state has always derived its power from the world's most powerful nation. This was powerful. Israel is, in reality, a huge American military base masquerading as a country. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. So in Noam Chomsky has often written about the views expressed at the highest levels of the U.S. government after the Second World War, that the oil reserves of the Middle East are a stupendous source of strategic power. That's the word that the phrase that they used. And you don't need to consult American authorities to understand this. So when you have a global economy that is based, dependent to such a degree on fossil fuels, and you have easily accessible, abundant, high quality oil available to you in massive quantities in this region, of course it's going to be a region of a source of stupendous strategic power to anybody who is able to control that region. And so in the aftermath of World War II, hot on the heels of the defeat of the Nazi forces, and invoking the crimes, the horrible crimes that had been committed against the Jewish people, by the Nazis and by other Europeans, not by Palestinians, the Western powers decided to create this state purportedly, ostensibly, as a sanctuary for the Jewish people. Now, this idea should have been viewed as preposterous from the outset. How are you going to make the Jewish people safer by inserting them into an area that is already inhabited and has been inhabited for centuries by another people who are part of a larger population of Arabs, numbering in the hundreds of millions in the region, and divesting them by means of violence of their land? This is going to make Jewish people safe. I mean, it was absolutely preposterous that this was going to make them safe, and that was not the reason. Now, I know that there are many people in the Jewish community who are, who are genuinely and sincerely attached to Israel and do feel a bond to Israel. I don't deny that for 1 second. I don't believe, however, that the motivation of Western governments for creating Israel or supporting the creation of Israel in 1948 was motivated by a desire to offer a sanctuary to the Jewish people. If they really were serious about that, they would have done something like carve out some piece of Germany, the genocidal state that was most responsible for the Holocaust, and given that to the Jewish people and enabled them to exercise sovereignty over that land. Something along those lines, but sending them to Palestine and using them in order to establish what was in effect a huge military base was not going to make them safer. And what from the first government to recognize the state of Israel was the Truman administration, which waited, I think, 11 minutes. Since then, Israel has become the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in history by a wide margin. As I mentioned, $3.8 billion a year goes to Israel in military aid every single year. And now they're going to get another $14 billion of aid, partially military, I'm sure. In times of candor, leading U.S. figures have acknowledged that Israel is in effect the American hammer in the Middle East. So Biden has said repeatedly, and it's amazing how Biden, when his mouth starts going, he can reveal inadvertently extraordinarily compromising facts about American foreign policy. And he has said recently, and he's been saying for some 20 years, that if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent Israel to protect our interests in the region. Okay. And the title of my article comes from a statement by Alexander Haig, I believe was the Secretary of Defense under Ronald Reagan, who said that Israel is America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. So the statements, and I could go on, but there's statements from high-ranking U.S. officials which effectively acknowledge that this hyper-militarized little country, I mean, it's a small country, but as a military base, it's enormous relative to the size of normal military bases. It is jam-packed full of the most advanced American military weaponry. It is a society which is not only militarized in terms of its weaponry, but in terms of its conscription. This is the entire population basically has an obligation to serve, subject to certain exceptions in the Israeli military. And as I mentioned at the outset, is engaged over and over again in acts of violent aggression against its neighboring states with total impunity. And it's gotten away with that because of the United States basically protecting it. And the ultimate example of this, I mean, the very recent example of this is what happened on October 7th. What happened? Israel immediately needed the United States to send 2 aircraft battle carrier groups to the Middle East region in order to protect it from the consequences of its own criminality. So there is clearly a relationship of extraordinary dependence between Israel and the United States. It is highly militarized, that relationship. The society is highly militarized. And it's absolutely clear that Israel, in effect, imposes, it's a tool whereby the United States government imposes its will on any disobedient government or regime in the Middle East, this source of stupendous strategic power.
All right, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the influence. Is the United States the dog that wags the tail, or is the United States the tail that Israel, the dog, wags? People have discussed this openly for some time. You have said that, well, it's the United States and Israel is like America's glove in the Middle East. Is the relationship something more than that? Because it's well known to a lot of us that Israel has an enormous influence on the United States political process. You have AIPAC. There's not an American politician at the federal level anyway, running for any office who would dare to defy AIPAC, who would not show up to talk to that group when it meets, pronouncing their complete support for Israel. We see it in the funding process. You mentioned the billions of dollars that have gone to Israel. The other thing that a lot of people who are not afraid of being called anti-Semitic, and I'm one of them, are the dozens of people, representatives of the United States government in the Senate, in the House, and in Biden's administration who hold dual citizenship in the United States and Israel. Is this not part of the power, the influence that's being exercised? And from that point of view, and I'm no lawyer, but from that point of view, it would seem to me that Israel exercises a great deal of power over the United States.
Well, I think that, AIPAC and the government of Israel and other pro-Israel groups in the country are certainly very adept at punishing politically, reputationally, by any and all means possible, any political candidate who gets out of line vis-a-vis the U.S.-Israel relationship, who is critical of Israel, who calls for Israel's leaders to be accountable. And AIPAC and these groups in the Israeli government are very, very good at doing just that. So you saw recently Rashida Tlaib, a Democratic congresswoman from Michigan, who is of Palestinian origin, calling out these heinous crimes being, censured by her own party. And I saw a report recently that I believe AIPAC it was, or somebody else, some other pro-Israel group or individual with a lot of money offered some candidate millions of dollars in campaign funding if he would give up a run for a Senate seat and run against Tlaib for the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives in her district. So this is the kinds of activities that they engage in. Anybody who gets out of line, and there's no elected official since October 7th in the United States who's gotten more out of line, shall we say, in other words, been a decent human being than Rashida Tlaib. So this is just one example. There are countless examples of candidates, actually elected officials or people running for political office who have been destroyed or greatly diminished, undermined by the Israel lobby. But I would point out that while the influence of the Israel lobby and the Israeli government in U.S. politics is clearly of an extraordinary nature and has had dramatic impacts on the composition of the United States Congress and its attitude towards these issues, there are a lot of people, powerful people in American politics who are genuinely pro-Israel. They don't need to be intimidated. Biden is at the top of the list. Biden is a fanatical Zionist. He always has been. This is genuine, and I see no evidence whatsoever that he's being forced in the course of his political career to be an ardent supporter of Israel. Another person is Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is, 100% Zionist, fanatical. There are plenty of people in the core of the Republican Party, like Mitch McConnell. These people are genuinely committed to the dispossession of the Palestinian people and, the regional dominance of Israel in the Middle East and the whole concept of a Jewish state, which, basically consigns the Palestinian people to the status of second-class citizens or worse. These people don't need to be intimidated. So what happens is they work in concert with each other. You have the lobby, which acts as the hammer towards anybody who gets out of line, like Rashida Tlaib. And then you have the inner core, the powerful inner core of both the Republican and the Democratic Party, who are fully ideologically committed to Israel, to this whole project, and don't need to be intimidated by anybody. So that's why at the end of the day, I think it's really complex and doesn't do justice to the nature of the situation to say simply that Israel controls the United States government. The bottom line is any president in the United States decided to pull the plug on support for Israel, with the level of power that the American president has, Israel would be obliged to change its behavior. They won't change their policies towards Israel because they agree with what Israel does. At the end of the day, that's why they won't do it, not because they're afraid.
Let me ask you this. You've been talking about some people who are genuinely pro-Israel. Is it a matter of, I think, a number of things? Being afraid to be called anti-Semitic? Are these politicians like Mitch McConnell, like Joe Biden, and like others, is this a ideological or theological position they're taking, or do they really know when they say America's interests anywhere in the world, but specifically Middle East, they really believe that it's about oil and being able to maintain their grasp, their power over that region to secure that oil? Is that part of it?
I think it's all of the above. I think, it depends upon which particular politician we're talking about. There are politicians, fairly influential, powerful politicians in the United States who probably are uncomfortable with what Israel is doing, but ultimately they keep their mouths shut because, A, they think it's in the interests of the United States government to maintain this giant military base masquerading as a country, and B, they're afraid of being, targeted by AIPAC and being smeared as anti-Semites. There's unquestionably people like that in American politics. But again, I think the inner core of the Republican and the Democratic Party, for both ideological reasons and for practical reasons, are truly and genuinely and passionately committed to this project that we call Israel, of this project of regional domination. They don't need to be intimidated by anybody. They believe in it. They believe in the rhetoric surrounding the creation of Israel, even though, a lot of it is just complete nonsense. They believe in the idea. They fundamentally view Arabs as being inferior, as not being full human beings. They think it's the entitlement of, colonizers who come predominantly from the West to dispossess them of their land. They believe that. They're racists. They're anti-Arab racists. But they're also imperialists. And Israel serves the imperialist agenda of the United States in the region extraordinarily effectively. So it's all of the above for the core of the Democratic and the Republican Party, notwithstanding the fact that, sure, there are a lot of people in American politics who probably are uncomfortable with what Israel is doing, but they keep their mouths shut because they don't want to be smeared as anti-Semites and be targeted with the considerable campaign finance capacity of groups like AIPAC.
Right. I'm going to quote again from your article. There are so many great quotes. You wrote this: Israel's true raison d'etre is to intimidate, harass, contain, and, if necessary, destroy any Middle Eastern government which refuses to submit to the United States domination. This is my question. All of these Middle Eastern governments, most of them have been in bed with the United States for a long time. I questioned on October 7th and in the days and weeks after that, where was the Arab and Islamic world, nations of the region, who clearly understand what's at stake? Where were they in not entering the fight? Mm-hmm. That for them isn't just about what's happening in Gaza. It's what's been happening to them for decades and decades. What are your thoughts?
The Middle East is, not monolithic. So there are certain places where the brute force of Israel, the enforcer, is not required in order for the United States so-called interests to be protected in the region. One such government is Jordan. Jordan's government has been completely co-opted by the United States. Another one, probably even worse, because it cooperates in the suffocation of Gaza, is the dictatorship in Egypt. Been completely co-opted. I believe they're the second biggest recipient in the region of U.S. military aid, the dictatorship of Egypt. So there, you don't need Israel engaging in acts of violence, overt or covertly, in order to impose discipline on these countries. But then there are countries like, Iran, and that's the biggest example I think that exists today in the region of a government that simply refuses to submit to U.S. domination and has done so for decades. Israel has repeatedly attacked Iranian military forces. So in Syria, it even openly confesses to this. It has no right to attack Iranian military forces in Syria. Those forces, there's no evidence that they have been attacking Israel. There's no evidence that they're preparing to attack Israel that I know of. And they are there in Syria at the invitation of the internationally recognized government of Syria, that of Bashar al-Assad. Whatever you may think of him, he is the internationally recognized leader of Syria, and therefore has every right to say to the Iranians, we want you to come in here, bring your military forces, and help defend us from our opponents. So they've been attacking Iranian military forces. They almost certainly have launched very harmful cyber attacks on Iran. These are acts of war. They have, either directly or through proxies, assassinated Iranian nuclear scientists. Again, acts of war. So Iran is a prime example of a government in the region which refuses to submit to U.S. domination and has been repeatedly struck by Israel. And the only reason why Israel, I think there's a practical reason why Israel, in the case of Iran, hasn't gone further. It's committed many acts of war against Iran, many. But has it launched a full-scale military attack on Iran? No, because I think that if it did that, it would be met with devastating consequences. The Iranians have sufficient conventional ballistic missile capacity to flatten large parts of Israel and cause a degree of damage to Israel that it has never experienced in its existence. So what is Israel now trying to do? It's trying to bring in, the Godfather to help it finish off the Iranian government, because it can't do that alone in that particular instance. And then you have the Houthis in Yemen. Again, this is another example of a government from the region that is, hotly opposed to what is being done to the Palestinians. They've seized an Israeli-owned civilian vessel. They've launched ballistic missiles and drones against Israel. You have Hezbollah, which is not the government of Lebanon, but is in the government of Lebanon and is probably the most powerful political force in Lebanon, launching every day since October 7th, repeated and quite significant attacks on military personnel and military materiel in the north of Israel. So there are forces within the region that are opposing Israel. They are the ones that are principally the targets of the wrath of Israel over the years, because they won't do the bidding of the United States government. Others, as I say, including the ones I've mentioned, there's no need to use violence to bring them into line, because they've been completely co-opted. They're corrupt, autocratic regimes whose only interest is not in satisfying the demands of their people, who are extremely upset about what's being done to Palestinians. Their only interest is to enrich themselves. And that's precisely what they've done at the expense of the Palestinian people.
Okay. The last topic for tonight, I think. I think it's very apparent that Israel's influence, its supposed myth of absolute safety and security, has been blown to pieces. And not just on October 7th, but every day since then, when you mentioned what other Arab Muslim states, entities are doing to hit targets inside Israel. It is obvious that Iron Dome, or whatever they call it, that fence that supposedly can detect when an ant sneezes, was easily overcome on October 7th. That has sent shivers up the spine, I have to think, of every Israeli. In fact, I'm hearing that many are leaving the country. I think they're afraid, they're fleeing. Israel's declining power, or the myth of its power and influence, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're going to continue talking about this next week, the decline of the power and influence of its protector. Your thoughts on this before we finish?
There's no question in my mind, and I totally agree with you. And I think that this is certainly in the non-Western world and within Israeli society itself, the prevailing view that Israel's army is no longer, assuming it ever was, I don't think it ever was invincible, but it certainly was a more formidable military force in prior years, but it's no longer an invincible military force. It's not even close to an invincible military force. If you look at the weaponry at the at the disposal of the Israeli military, compare it to the weaponry at the disposal of Hamas and other military groups, it's absolutely remarkable, astonishing, shocking, and humiliating from the Israeli perspective that those militants managed to overrun, I believe, 4 Israeli military bases on that day, temporarily take control of a number of communities, Israeli communities close to Gaza, and fired volley after volley of rockets, many of which inflicted significant damage, even though those rockets, technologically speaking, are quite primitive, and Israel is supposed to have, the world's most advanced air defense system, the so-called Iron Dome. I mean, anybody looking at this objectively would say, this is not an invincible military. It's not even remotely close to an invincible military. And there's a couple of reasons why this has happened. One is Israel has, ever since it was humiliated in 2006 by Hezbollah, and it was, it sent some up to 30,000 of its soldiers to confront Hezbollah in South Lebanon, and up to 1,000 Hezbollah fighters inflicted such damage on Israel militarily that they were forced to withdraw. And the Israelis wanted Hezbollah to be completely disarmed. Not only was Hezbollah not disarmed as they demanded, but in fact, it's much stronger now than it ever was. At the time, it was estimated to have at its disposal some 15,000 missiles. Now it has perhaps in excess of 150,000 missiles, many of which are more destructive and more precise than those that Hezbollah possessed at that time. Since Hezbollah, put a beating on the Israeli military in 2006, again with far less military weaponry than was at the disposal of the Israeli military, what has Israel done militarily? It's basically used its military assets to oppress and brutalize a largely defenseless civilian population. For you to be an effective combat force, you need to engage in combat from time to time. And this is exactly, I think, a big part of the reason why the whole of NATO was defeated in Afghanistan by a ragtag insurgent force called the Taliban, who possessed little more than Soviet-era small arms, because they lost the ability over years, decades of simply, bombing countries into oblivion from a distance, a safe distance. They lost the ability, Western powers, military forces, to engage in effective combat, particularly against a determined and sophisticated enemy. And this is what's happened to Israel. But part of the sort of humiliation stems from the fact that Israel's military capacity was always overrated, always. And I think what's happened in Ukraine has been an extraordinary demonstration of the degree to which these wonder weapons that, the United States possesses and sells at obscene prices to its so-called allies are grotesquely overrated. They're not nearly as precise. They're not nearly as powerful. They're not nearly as effective in terms of, their electronic jamming capabilities aren't nearly as strong as advertised. Their air defense systems aren't nearly as effective as advertised, and on and on and on. There was always a certain degree of mythology and hyperbole surrounding this weaponry, and that has now been exposed, both in Israel, in the war in Ukraine, in Afghanistan, and so forth. And so what you have at the end of the day is, I think, a perception throughout the Middle East and the world at large, particularly in the non-Western world, that Israel is a lot more vulnerable today than we understood it to be years ago. And this is going to have dramatic and profound consequences for the future security of Israel in the months and years ahead.
Well, let's talk about the United States. Its power, its fighting power, its financial power, its political influence is in very steep decline. I think the conflict in Ukraine clearly brought that out. That NATO was not an effective fighting force. And let's face it, there were all kinds of NATO troops in there on the ground, commanders, that's been documented. All that whiz bang equipment, supposedly, and 180 some billion dollars we've dumped in there. Ukraine is defeated. It has been defeated. It's not a stalemate. Every single day and night, Russia does not send its troops to be killed. They're using their missiles, they're using their drones multiple times a night, a day, bombing strategic installations and infrastructure in Ukraine. There's nothing left of that country except whatever public information still is propping it up. Russia knows exactly what's going on. But as the rest of the world watched that, as the rest of the world watched these incredible sanctions that they thought would cripple and take down Putin and Russia, had the opposite effect and is actually destroying their own countries, their own economies, and not only economies, they're being inundated with immigrants that they really don't want. So as the rest of the world watches, and on top of that, the BRICS movement, the de-dollarization movement is being seen by people around the world. More and more countries are getting involved and want to be involved. It is clear that the power and influence of the United States is in very rapid decline. We'll talk about this next time as well, but in terms of Israel's future, not many people, but there are some who are calling in to question whether Israel has a future. Your thoughts before we finish?
I want to add one thing to your comments about what happened in Ukraine, the impacts it's had, with which I completely concur. And that is, for 20 some odd months, we were told, we as in the peoples of the world, were told every day, day after day, incessantly, sanctimoniously, obsessively, assertively, arrogantly, how absolutely vitally important it was that the entire world sanction Russia and provide whatever military assistance it could provide to the noble Ukrainian government, because this was a question of maintaining the international rules-based order, and human rights were at risk, and the robust democracy of Ukraine was being threatened by the evil Russian Empire, every day. And any government that didn't line up behind the Western efforts to wage this proxy war, both at a military and economic level against the Russian Federation, was, lambasted and threatened. And intimidation was employed over and over again to try to get everybody to fall into line behind the United States government on this war. And then, Regis, the most remarkable thing happened. On one day, they turned on a dime and abandoned all pretense of being on the side of human rights and international law and democracy, and said, we are going to support Israel to the hilt, even while it's committing a genocide before the eyes of the world. So it's not just the military and economic power of the West and the United States which have been severely damaged. Whatever remained of the moral authority of the United States government and its Western vassal governments has been completely destroyed, absolutely and utterly destroyed. They have no credibility whatsoever. Anybody who hears from an American official or a French official or a Canadian official, any government from the global South, from Asia, they're lectured, they're moralized about the need to protect international law. It's going to laugh at these people. Laugh at them, scorn at them, scoff at them. They have zero moral authority. And again, we can sit there and pretend, as the elites do in the West, that this isn't going to have implications for Western power, Western prosperity, Western security, but it will. It will. We have lost any ability to use moral suasion and soft power with the non-Western world as a result of this grotesque and obscene and shameless hypocrisy that we're seeing in Gaza today. You know, and the number one country that's going to be impacted by this, I believe, is Israel, because it's so vulnerable. Over the longer term, the United States will be dramatically impacted as well. But in the near term, this pipsqueak of a country that is so dependent upon American power and brute force is going to have to come to terms with the complete loss of Western moral authority in the world.